Students, in our last classes, we have already discussed regarding the meaning of supply, the difference between stock and supply, determinants of supply, and the law of supply. Today, we will discuss regarding the meaning of change in quantity supplied and change in supply. What is the difference in between the two? What do we mean by change in quantity supplied? And what do we mean by change in supply? That we will discuss today in this class. So, we know that from the topic determinants of supply or factors influencing supply, that supply of a commodity is influenced by many factors. They are price of the commodity, techniques of production, price of relative goods, number of farms, goals of the farms, government taxation policy, future price expectation, natural factors, and many others. But in this discussion, we will divide the whole factors into two parts. Number one is price of the commodity, and number two is other factors. We are dividing it into two parts. First one is price of the commodity and all the factors in number two. All other factors means which are the non-price determinants. As we have said, price of relative goods, price of factors of production, technology of production, goals of the producers, number of farms, government policy, future price expectation, etc. So, when price of the commodity changes, other things remaining constant, there occurs change in quantity supplied. Remember it. Only when price of the commodity changes, either price increases or price decreases, other things must remain constant. At that time, there occurs a change in quantity supplied. There may be expansion of supply or there may be contraction of supply. Remember it. But when other things undergo a change without any change in the price of the commodity, then there occurs change in supply. Change in supply implies a change in other factors without any change in the price of the commodity. Remember this, right? So in change in quantity supplied, there is only a change in price, only a change in the price of the commodity. But in change in supply, other things change without any change in the price of the commodity. So at first we will study regarding change in quantity supplied in detail. What is the meaning of change in quantity supplied? When quantity supplied changes, change in quantity supplied happens when? Occurs when? When that changes the price of the commodity without any change in other factors. So when quantity supplied changes due to a change in the price of the commodity, it is expressed by different points on the supply curve. A single supply curve is given and the seller or the producer moves from one point of the supply curve to another point of the supply curve. Or we can say there is a movement along the supply curve in case of change in quantity supplied. You see this diagram? In this diagram, SS is the only supply curve, is a single supply curve which indicates change in quantity supplied, which shows change in quantity supplied, how he moves from point A to point B and point A to point C. You mark here. With a change in the price is given in OY axis, vertical axis, and in OX axis, it is given quantity supplied. You see how the seller moves from one point to another point in the diagram, in the supply curve. So there is movement along the supply curve. You see, in this diagram, SS is the supply curve. OP is the original price. Mark here, OP is the original price. And OQ is the original quantity or original quantity supplied. When price rises to OP1, quantity supplied increases to OQ1. Or we can say with a rise in price from OP to OP1 or by PP1, quantity supplied increases from OQ to OQ1 or by QQ1. Here the seller moves from point A to point B in the supply curve. Right? But when price falls to OP2, quantity supplied decreases to OQ2. You see here in the diagram, with a fall in the price to OP2, quantity supplied decreases to OQ2. The seller moves from point A to C in the supply curve. In this case, with a fall in the price from OP to OP2, OP2, the seller moves from point A to point C in the supply curve. Here the seller moves from one point to another point of the same supply curve. You mark here. Change in quantity supplied is shown by a single supply curve. There are no multiple supply curves, right? In a single curve, single supply curve, it is shown, right? So there is movement from one point to another point with a change in the price of the commodity, right? So due to rise in price when quantity supplied increases, it is known as expansion of supply. Remember that. Remember, what do you mean by expansion of supply? When price of a commodity increases and quantity supplied thereby increases, it is known as expansion of supply. But when price of a commodity falls and quantity supplied thereby falls or decreases, it is known as contraction of supply. So expansion of supply and contraction of supply, they are the terms which are used in case of change in quantity supplied. Remember it, right? Then we will come to change in supply. You see, change in supply, I have already told you that change in supply occurs when other things change without any change in price of the commodity. Or we can say when non-price determinants of supply undergo change, there occurs a change in supply. Here the seller moves from one supply curve to another supply curve. There are multiple supply curves are given in case of change in supply. The seller can move or can shift from a supply curve to the right supply curve or towards left supply curve. Right? So in other words, supply curve shifts either to the right or left. So there are multiple supply curves in case of change in supply. Remember it. Change in supply occurs when only one other factors change without any change in price. You see the diagram? In this case, there are three supply curves, SS, S1, S1 and S2, S2. SS is the original supply curve. Without any change in price, price remains constant at OP. Due to change in other factors, the supply curve shifts to the right, that is to S1, S1, or it may shift to left, or which is indicated by S2, S2. Right? You see, in this diagram, SS is the original supply curve, when non-price determinants, SS is the original supply curve, when non-price determinants like number of farms increases. For example, number of farm increases. So when farm increases, generally the production will also increase and the supply will increase at the same price. Right? And when production techniques improve, so supply, total production will increase and supply will increase. So in this case, the supply curve shifts to the right, which is indicated by S1, S1 supply curve in the diagram. There is increase in supply from OQ to OQ1. Mark this. When the supply curve shifts from, there is a shift in supply curve from SS to S1, S1, the total supply increases from OQ to OQ1. Right? But if the number of farms, for example, decreases or cost of production increases, then what happens? The supply curve shifts to the left which is indicated by S2 supply curve. In this case, there is a decrease in supply from OQ to OQ1. Right? There is a decrease in supply from OQ to OQ1. Now, due to a change in non-price determinants or due to a change in other factors when supply falls, it is known as decrease in supply. Remember it. It is known as decrease in supply. But when supply rises due to a change in other factors, it is known as increase in supply. Here you see there has been an increase in supply by QQ1 and there has been a decrease in supply by QQ2 due to a change in other factors. So we have known that, we have already discussed what we have already discussed. We know that in case of change in quantity supplied, the price of the commodity only changes, other things remain constant. And in this case, we use the terms expansion of supply and contraction of supply. But in case of change in quantity supplied, there is a single supply curve which indicates the change in quantity supplied and the seller moves from one point to another point of the supply curve. But in case of change in supply, there are multiple supply curves, more than one supply curves. The supply curve which is to the right of the original supply curve indicates an increase in supply, and the supply curve which is towards the left of the supply curve indicates a decrease in the supply. So in case of change in supply, we use the terms increase in supply and decrease in supply, right? So this is all about the change in quantity supplied and change in supply. So we will meet in our next class. Till then, goodbye. Have a nice day. Thank you all.